If you were to look back along the rear of your engine, along the firewall, you're going to be able to find your spark plug wires and your distributor cap. There's a couple little clips on this. I'm just going to use a pocket screwdriver, come underneath here, lift this tab, and separate it. Now I'm going to come over to this, lift this tab, separate that as well. At this point, we can go ahead and pull this away, and we have better access to our distributor cap. Before we go ahead and remove any of the wires, let's go ahead and mark them first. I'm just going to wipe this down real quick so we can have a peek. If you look along the cap, you can see some numbers on it. That's going to correspond to the cylinder that the wire is going to lead to. Now I'm just going to wipe down the wires, and I'll mark the wires with the same number that's on the cap where it corresponds to. Once you have everything marked, go ahead and disconnect the wires and set them aside. Perfect. Now we have a mess all around our distributor cap, so we're going to go ahead and clean this out of here. Okay, now the next thing we need to do is use a Torx bit, a T20. We're going to come right down into this area where you can see the slots on the actual cap itself, and there's going to be 2 bolts. I'm going to remove the forward one and then the rear. Once those are both loose, let's continue on by removing our cap. Now let's get under the truck and put the engine on top dead center. Underneath the front of the truck, we're going to have to remove this shield right here. You're going to find there's 6 mounting bolts that look like this. Set this aside. Now that we have the shield off, we have a clear view of our harmonic balancer that's supposed to be mounted to the crank of our engine. Something that we want to pay attention to is this little marking right along here. You can see that it's carved right into that harmonic balancer. Something else that I want to pay attention to is that there's supposed to be 2 of those markings. So what I want to do is find one, and then I'm going to feel along and see if I can find a second one, and it should come somewhere along the area not too far after that one. So this one, I'm feeling along this side, and I can tell that I don't feel any more markings. I'm going to come up along the other end of this. Just after it, I can find that there's another marking. So essentially we have 2 markings, one right after the other. All right, so we know that this one right here that I can physically see is the second marking. So now what we're going to do is we're going to use a crayon, and I'm going to mark this area right. Let's see if I can get. Looking at the engine, you can see the area where I marked with my crayon. That's going to be the area that we need to have that other marking lined up with. Now the next thing I'm going to do is use a nice long ratchet like this with a 16mm socket and extension, and I'm going to come to this crank bolt right there. We're going to continue on by turning this clockwise until that marking lines up with our yellow mark right here. Okay, I can feel compression on the engine here. Okay, I'm bringing that right around. I can see that I have my marking lined up. So I'm just going to bring this first marking down so the 2 crayon marks line up. And then the second marking, the one that trails it, is going to be located up on top. There's another marking you can check up there just to ensure that it's lined up perfectly. Now we just want to come back up top and ensure that we're lined up with where we need to be. Something that I want to take note of is this contact point right along here. If you were on top dead center on this particular truck, it would line up with this area right along here. You can tell on our distributor we have a little arrow or a triangle that has a number 6 on it. What we want to do is make sure that this is going to be lined up with that when we're done. So let's get back under the truck. We're going to turn that crank back around again, and we're going to hopefully end up with this lined up. Now the next thing we need to do is remove our electrical connector here. Go ahead and lift up on this tab and then draw it away from your distributor. It's always a good idea to make sure you check your electrical connectors and just ensure that you don't see any corrosion. This looks great, so I'll set it aside. Now let's move over to the passenger side of the distributor. If you look down along the base of it, you're going to see a mounting bolt. We need to remove that bolt and then draw our distributor up and out. There's our mounting bolt. Now that we have the bolt out, the next thing we want to do is make sure that we have a crayon handy or something that we can mark the distributor with. What we want to pay attention to is this area right along here. We can see that it's lined up with our 6 mark on here, but once you start lifting up the distributor straight up, you're going to notice that this is going to spin, and I'll show you why once it's out. Once we start lifting it up and we notice that it stops spinning, we're just going to quickly mark the casing on the distributor where this line is. So I'm just going to go ahead and mark that real quick. And now let's lift it straight up and out. There it is, friends. All right, now with the distributor out of the way, we have a nice clear view of our oil pressure sensor right along here. Obviously, we have wiring that's going to lead to that, but on top of the wiring, we obviously have this evap line right here. For that, you can see that there's a little gray clip right along here. I'm going to use some long nose pliers and grab onto the top aspect and the bottom aspect, squeeze them together, and then draw this away. And we'll just get that out of the way. Right underneath that, you can see that there's a little tab that we're going to have to grab with our thumb, then we'll draw off the wiring. Just lift up on that. Check your electrical connector. This looks great. Set it aside. Now let's look at our brand new OP switch. You're going to see that you're going to need a special socket to be able to remove it. That socket's going to look like this. Slides right over the entire housing of it and then goes right in. Before we go too much further, let's just use a nice clean rag and put it inside of the distributor hole. That's just going to essentially help keep any debris out of there while we work. Now we're going to use our special OP switch socket. Slide it right over that switch. I'm going to get my ratchet on there and start removing it. If I look down at the threaded area, you can tell that it wasn't necessarily screwed all the way in until it was bottomed out. It still had a couple threads on there, so that's approximately where we need to put the new one in till. There it is, friends. Now let's just take a quick look at our old part compared to our new one. Look at the threaded area. You can tell that the old one wasn't necessarily screwed all the way in until it was bottomed out. So just pay attention to that as we get ready for our install. Here we go. I'll go ahead and put that into my socket. Now as we put this in, we want to basically just go to where that threaded area ends. Now that we have that screwed in, let's go ahead and put on our wiring connector here. Give it a nice click. Now I'm going to go ahead and reconnect in that evap line. Just go ahead and press it into the line. You should hear a click. There it is. Give it a nice tug and make sure it's secure. Okay, something that I wanted to show you real quick on the bottom of our distributor is this area right inside the center there. You can see that it almost looks like a flat blade in there. If you were to take a peek down inside the hole in the engine where this is supposed to go, you're going to find an area where that flat blade should sit into. That's part of the oil pump for this. So if you notice when you're putting down your distributor, it doesn't seem like it wants to slide down. That's due to an alignment issue with this right here. Something else you want to pay attention to is the gasket. Make sure that the gasket's on there. And of course, if you can keep it up high while you're doing it, it's going to ensure that it doesn't get damaged in the installation process. Let's line this up with where it needs to be, right along here, and get ready for our install. Okay. So it looks like our rotor moved a little bit here, so I'm just going to line it back up to start. Start sliding this down. Okay, so it just fell down into its spot, and now that it's sitting into its spot, I can see that my area here is lined up on the distributor housing where it needs to be. But if for some reason yours isn't, you need to just go ahead and lift up your distributor and then move it so it's gonna. Essentially, if you drop this down and it looked like it was a little bit too far this way, you would just lift it up and then bring this head a little bit clockwise, and then vice versa if it was the other way. Now it's gonna be time to get our bolt in there. Make sure that the threads are nice and clean. Just gonna go ahead and put the bolt in there. We'll start it in and then we'll snug it up. All right, so it feels like it bottomed out right there. I'm just gonna give it a teeny bit more. We definitely don't want to break the bolt off, but we also want to make sure that the distributor is nice and tight to the engine. Now let's connect in our wiring. Give it a nice click and a nice wiggle. Make sure it doesn't fall out. Now it's going to be time to put on the cap. Obviously we want the side with the 4 prongs coming over towards the passenger side, and we're going to have the side with the 3 towards the driver's. I'm just going to carefully set this down and in here. We want to line up those tabs so that the screws will line up. All right, now let's put in our new screws. I'm just going to start this in, and then we'll start the other one in, and then we'll tighten them up. Now at this point, I'm just going to go ahead and bottom this out. Okay, stopped right there, just a teeny bit more. Do the same to the other. Okay, perfect. Okay, now it's going to be time to get our wires back on here. When we do this, we want to just make sure that we put them back on to where we originally took them off of the distributor. So I've got my coil wire. Make sure that when you push them on, they go all the way on and not sitting halfway off. Obviously, when you put these on, also, you want to make sure that the wires aren't crossing and tying a knot or anything like that. Perfect. Now let's get our wiring re-secured. I'm going to connect in our wiper motor. Give it a nice wiggle. Okay, now that we have that all installed, we need to, of course, start up the truck and ensure that we don't have a misfire, and we also need to make sure that, of course, the truck starts overall. So once I start up the truck, I'm going to come running back out here, and I want to watch the engine, see if it's shaking around a lot or just even a little bit. Here we go. Perfect. Okay, so our truck runs perfect, but maybe for some reason after your install, it didn't. If that's the case, it's a possibility that maybe you didn't have something lined up properly. Or maybe when you did have it lined up, when you went ahead and put it into the engine, this spun a little bit, and then you didn't recheck it to make sure it's lined up with where it needs to be at the end. If that's the case, you're going to want to remove the cap that comes on top of this. You're going to go back underneath the truck, put the engine on top dead center with those lines that I showed you before, and when you are, you want to have this facing right where your number 6 is, right there. If you notice that for some reason you're off just a little bit like this, then you're probably just off one tooth. And of course, let's put our shield back up.